The Arizona heat shimmered off the cracked asphalt like a fever dream, and Elena Rodriguez knew she was running out of time. Her beaten Honda sputtered to a stop for the third time that morning, steam rising from under the hood like white flags of surrender. In the passenger seat, a small brown and white goat named Pepper bleated softly, her amber eyes reflecting the same exhaustion that weighed heavy on Elena's shoulders. 3 months. That's how long it had been since Elena had made the worst mistake of her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months since she'd taken the money from the Children's Charity Fund at Sacred Heart Elementary, where she'd worked as the beloved third-grade teacher for 7 years. 3 months since her world had collapsed in a cascade of desperate choices and crushing guilt. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd stolen money meant to help underprivileged kids buy school supplies, when she herself had grown up poor, relying on the kindness of teachers who'd seen potential in a shy girl with patched clothes and dreams bigger than her circumstances. But when her younger brother Miguel had been diagnosed with leukemia, and the insurance company had denied coverage for the experimental treatment that could save his life, Elena had found herself staring at the charity fund's bank statements with trembling hands. $57,000. That's what she'd taken, transferring it in small amounts over 6 weeks to pay for Miguel's treatment. She'd told herself she'd pay it back somehow, that she'd find a way to replace every penny before anyone noticed. But the school's annual audit had come early, and Elena's carefully constructed house of cards had tumbled down in a single afternoon. The memory of Principal Watson's disappointed face still haunted her dreams. The woman who'd mentored Elena, who'd helped her get her teaching degree, who'd been like a mother to her after Elena's own mother had passed away from cancer 5 years earlier. The betrayal in those kind eyes had been worse than any legal consequence. Elena had resigned before they could fire her, packed her few belongings, loaded Pepper into her car, and driven west with no destination in mind. The criminal charges would come eventually, she knew. Detective Morrison had made that clear when he'd questioned her. But for now, she was buying time, trying to figure out how to live with what she'd done. Pepper had been Miguel's goat originally, a therapy animal recommended by his treatment team to help him cope with the isolation of his illness. The little goat had lived in their small backyard in Tucson, providing comfort during Miguel's darkest days. When Miguel had finally lost his battle 3 weeks ago, despite all the expensive treatments Elena had stolen to afford, Pepper had been the only living thing that understood her grief. Now, as Elena sat on the side of Highway 89, watching steam pour from her car's engine, she wondered if this was how her story would end. Stranded in the middle of nowhere with a goat and a conscience so heavy it felt like it might crush her chest. She pulled out her phone, but the screen showed no signal bars. The nearest town, according to the last road sign she'd seen, was Sage Creek, still 15 miles ahead. Behind her, the road stretched back toward a past she couldn't face. Ahead lay uncertainty, but at least it was movement forward. Elena gathered Pepper's leash and the small backpack that contained everything she owned now. Her savings had been drained paying for Miguel's funeral, and the guilt money was long gone to medical bills. She had maybe $200 left to her name and a car that would never run again. The sun was merciless as they began walking, Elena's sneakers already filling with sand and pebbles. Pepper trotted beside her with surprising resilience, her small hooves clicking against the asphalt in a rhythm that was almost comforting. Every few minutes a truck would roar past, creating a brief windstorm of dust and debris, but no one stopped. Elena's throat was parched within the first hour, and she found herself rationing the single bottle of water she'd grabbed from the car. Pepper seemed to sense her distress and stayed close, occasionally nuzzling against Elena's leg in a gesture of support that brought tears to her eyes. As they walked, Elena's mind wandered back to the classroom she'd loved so much. Room 14 at Sacred Heart Elementary, with its bright yellow walls covered in student artwork and reading charts. She remembered the way 8-year-old Sophia's face had lit up when she'd finally mastered long division, or how quiet Tommy had come out of his shell during their weekly poetry circles. She'd been good at her job. More than good. She'd been the teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, who spent her own money on classroom supplies, who'd started the very charity fund she'd eventually stolen from. The children had trusted her, and she'd failed them all. The guilt was a living thing inside her chest, feeding on every memory of the students she'd let down. How many kids would go without new backpacks or winter coats because of her theft? How many promising young minds would struggle with outdated textbooks because she'd taken money meant for them? By the time the sun reached its peak, Elena was stumbling rather than walking. Her lips were cracked, her vision blurry from dehydration and exhaustion. Pepper's tongue was hanging out, and Elena knew she had to find water soon, or they'd both collapse. That's when she saw the mailbox. It stood at the end of a long dirt driveway, weathered and tilted slightly to one side. The name painted on its side had faded, but she could just make out Holloway Ranch in peeling blue letters. The driveway disappeared around a bend lined with scraggly mesquite trees, and Elena could hear the distant sound of water running. She hesitated. Trespassing on private property wasn't exactly the best way to stay under the radar, especially for someone trying to avoid law enforcement. But Pepper was panting heavily now, and Elena's own need for water was becoming desperate. She followed the driveway, Pepper staying close to her side. After about a quarter mile, the trees opened up to reveal a modest ranch house with a wraparound porch and a red metal roof. Several outbuildings dotted the property, and Elena could see horses grazing in a distant pasture. But what caught her attention immediately was the sound of running water growing louder. Behind the house, she could see the source. A natural spring bubbled up from between a cluster of rocks, creating a small stream that wound its way across the property. Elena's parched throat contracted at the sight. She was so focused on the water that she didn't notice the man sitting on the porch steps until he cleared his throat. Elena spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was probably in his early 40s, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed a trim. His clothes were work-worn but clean, and he held a coffee mug in one hand while studying her with curious brown eyes. "You look like you've had a rough morning," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that suggested he'd lived in Arizona his whole life. Elena instinctively took a step back, pulling Pepper closer. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to trespass. My car broke down on the highway, and we've been walking. We just need some water." The man's gaze shifted to Pepper, and Elena saw something change in his expression. Not suspicion or annoyance, but what looked almost like recognition. "That your goat?" he asked, setting down his coffee mug and standing up. "Yes, sir. Her name is Pepper. She won't cause any trouble, I promise." The man walked down the porch steps with an easy grace that spoke of years spent working with animals. As he got closer, Elena could see laugh lines around his eyes and calluses on his hands. There was something solid and reassuring about his presence, even though every instinct told her to run. "Name's Jake Holloway," he said, extending his hand. "This is my place." Elena hesitated before shaking his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, and she noticed he didn't squeeze too hard or hold on too long. "I'm Elena Rodriguez." Jake nodded toward the spring. "Help yourself to the water. Both of you look like you could use it." Elena wanted to cry with relief. She led Pepper to the stream, and they both drank deeply from the cool, clear water. It was the best thing Elena had tasted in days. When she finally looked up, Jake was leaning against a fence post, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. Behind him, she could see other animals moving around the property. Horses, obviously, but also what looked like sheep or goats in a separate pen. "You keep goats?" Elena asked, wiping water from her chin. "A few," Jake said. "Mostly for weed control. They're better than any machine at clearing brush, and they don't require gasoline." He paused, studying Pepper with renewed interest. "Your girl there looks like she's got some Nubian in her. Good breed for desert country." Elena looked down at Pepper, who was now investigating the area around the spring with obvious delight. The little goat's tail was wagging, and she seemed more animated than she'd been in weeks. "She belonged to my brother," Elena said quietly. "He passed away recently." Jake's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss." The simple words, spoken with genuine sympathy, almost undid Elena's carefully maintained composure. She bit her lip and nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds being the bubbling of the spring and the distant whinnying of horses. Elena found herself studying Jake's property with professional interest. Everything was well maintained, but not flashy. The fences were sturdy, the outbuildings in good repair, and she could see evidence of thoughtful land management in the way the pastures were rotated and the water sources protected. You said your car broke down? Jake asked eventually. About 15 miles back. Engine finally gave up. Elena managed a weak smile. I think it's been threatening to die for the last 1,000 miles. Where were you headed? The question Elena had been dreading. She couldn't very well say she was running from criminal charges and had no destination in mind. West, she said finally. Maybe California. I hear there are opportunities there. Jake studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her vague answer. But he didn't press. Sage Creek's the nearest town, he said. About 12 miles that way. He pointed in the direction Elena had been walking. You might find someone there willing to tow your car, though I'd be surprised if it's worth fixing. Elena's heart sank. She didn't have money for a tow, let alone car repairs. And even if she did, where would she go from there? She had no job prospects, no references she could use, and a criminal investigation probably closing in on her. Is there a bus station in Sage Creek? She asked, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. Greyhound stops there twice a week, Jake said. But not until Thursday. Today was Monday. Elena felt the weight of her situation settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. 3 days in a town where she knew no one. With barely enough money for food, let alone lodging, Pepper chose that moment to wander over to the fence line, where Elena could now see several goats on the other side. There was a large black and white one that looked like a boar cross, a smaller brown one that might have been a Spanish goat, and a young kid that was eyeing Pepper with obvious curiosity. The kid approached the fence first, stretching its neck through the slats to sniff at Pepper. Instead of backing away, Pepper moved closer, and within moments the two goats were touching noses through the fence. Jake watched this interaction with growing interest. Well, I'll be damned, he murmured. What? Elena asked. That kid there, the one making friends with your goat? His name's Trouble, and he's earned it. Been here 6 months, and he won't get within 10 feet of strangers. Humans, or animals. As if to prove Jake's point, Trouble was now trying to squeeze his head through the fence slats to get closer to Pepper, making soft bleating sounds that Pepper answered with gentle nuzzles. How did you end up with him? Elena asked, grateful for a topic that didn't involve her own complicated situation. Jake's expression grew thoughtful. Found him during a flash flood last spring. His mother didn't make it, and he was half drowned when I pulled him out of the wash. Nursed him back to health, but he's been skittish ever since. Won't bond with the other goats, won't let me get too close. The vet said some animals just never get over that kind of trauma. Elena watched Pepper and Trouble continue their fence-line courtship and felt something twist in her chest. She understood trauma, understood the way it could make you withdraw from the world, afraid to trust again. Maybe he just needed to meet the right friend, she said softly. Jake glanced at her, and Elena caught something in his expression that made her think he wasn't just talking about goats anymore. Maybe so. The sun was climbing higher, and Elena knew she needed to figure out her next move. She couldn't impose on this stranger's hospitality much longer, and Pepper was showing no signs of wanting to leave her new friend. I should probably get going, Elena said reluctantly. Thank you for the water, and for being kind to strangers. Where exactly are you planning to go? Jake asked. It's 12 miles to town in this heat, and you're already dehydrated. Elena looked down at Pepper, who was now lying down next to the fence, with Trouble mirroring her position on the other side. The two goats looked completely content, as if they'd been friends for years instead of minutes. I'll figure something out, Elena said, though she had no idea what that might be. Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the goats, then Elena, then the goats again. Finally, he seemed to come to some kind of decision. Tell you what, he said. I've got a weed problem. Elena blinked, confused by the apparent non sequitur. Excuse me? Jake gestured toward a large pasture that Elena hadn't noticed before. Even from this distance, she could see it was overgrown with what looked like prickly pear cactus and various thorny shrubs. That whole section there, Jake continued. It's been overrun for years. I've been meaning to clear it, but it's expensive to hire a crew. And dangerous work with all those thorns and the occasional rattlesnake. Elena still wasn't following. Okay. "Your goat there," Jake said, nodding toward Pepper. "She looks like she could handle tough browse. Goats are natural land clearers, especially in country like this." Understanding began to dawn on Elena, along with a flutter of something that might have been hope. "I've got a cabin out back," Jake continued, his tone carefully casual. "It's not much, just one room with a bed and a kitchenette, but it's got running water and electricity. Previous owner used it for ranch hands." Elena's heart began to beat faster. "What are you saying?" Jake met her eyes directly. "I'm saying your goat could stay if she eats weeds." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, though she wasn't sure if they were from relief or the terrible knowledge that she was about to accept kindness she didn't deserve. "I can't pay you," she said quietly. "I don't have much money." "Didn't ask for money," Jake replied. "Good land management is its own reward." "Besides," he added, glancing at Trouble, who was now dozing peacefully next to the fence, "looks like your Pepper might be exactly what my kid needs." Elena looked at the overgrown pasture, then at the small cabin visible through the trees, then at Pepper, who seemed to have found a sense of peace she hadn't shown since Miguel's death. It was too good to be true, which meant there had to be a catch. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help a stranger?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Let's just say I know what it's like to need a second chance." There was something in his voice that suggested a story Elena wasn't ready to hear yet, just as she wasn't ready to tell hers. But maybe that was okay. Maybe sometimes people could help each other without knowing all the details, without demanding explanations or confessions. "I have some conditions," Elena said, trying to maintain some dignity, even as her voice shook with emotion. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" "I work for my keep. I don't take charity. If Pepper clears your land, then I help with whatever else needs doing around here. I may not look like much right now, but I'm not afraid of hard work." Something shifted in Jake's expression, what might have been respect. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Fair enough. Can you handle a pitchfork?" Elena almost smiled. "I grew up on a small farm outside Tucson. I can handle anything you've got." "And your goat? She going to be a problem around the other animals?" Elena looked at Pepper, who was now standing with her front hooves on the bottom fence rail, trying to get closer to Trouble. "She's gentle as a lamb. Smarter than most people, too." Jake chuckled. "We'll see about that." He pushed himself away from the fence post. "Come on, I'll show you the cabin." As they walked across the property, Elena felt like she was in a dream. After 3 months of running, of sleeping in her car and washing in gas station bathrooms, the prospect of a real bed and 4 walls seemed almost too good to be true. The cabin was tucked behind a grove of cottonwood trees, small but charming with its log walls and green metal roof. Jake opened the door and gestured for Elena to enter. It was perfect. One large room with a double bed in one corner, a small kitchenette with a 2-burner stove and mini refrigerator, and a bathroom that included a shower that looked like it would provide actual water pressure. The windows were clean and let in plenty of light, and someone had left cheerful yellow curtains that made the space feel homey. Previous tenant left most of the furnishings, Jake explained, watching Elena take in the space. "Linens are in that closet there, and I stocked the kitchen with basics this morning." Elena turned to look at him, suspicion creeping in. "This morning? Before I showed up?" Jake had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "All right, so maybe I've been thinking about hiring some help for a while. Your timing was just fortunate." Elena studied his face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives. But Jake's expression was open and honest, and she found herself wanting to trust him despite every instinct that told her to be cautious. "What's the catch?" she asked. "Nobody is this kind to strangers without wanting something in return." Jake leaned against the doorframe, his hands shoved into his pockets. "No catch. Work hard, treat the animals well, and we'll get along fine. And if we don't get along, then you're free to leave any time you want. No questions asked." The offer was too generous, too perfect. Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't afford to show. "I need you to understand something," she said carefully. I'm not running from an abusive relationship or anything like that. My situation is complicated, and I can't promise I'll be able to stay long-term." Jake nodded slowly. "We all have our reasons for ending up where we do. I'm not asking for your life story, Elena. I'm just offering a place to rest while you figure out your next move." It was exactly what she needed to hear. Elena felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she realized that Jake wasn't expecting confessions or explanations. He was simply offering shelter, the same way he might offer water to a thirsty traveler. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, yes, thank you." Jake smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and more approachable. "Welcome to Holloway Ranch," he said. "Why don't you get settled in, and I'll introduce you to the rest of the animals. We can start surveying that problem pasture this afternoon if you're up for it." After Jake left, Elena sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the cabin that was, temporarily at least, hers. For the first time in months, she felt something approaching hope. Outside, she could hear Pepper's contented bleating as she continued her conversation with Trouble through the fence. Elena smiled despite herself. Maybe her brother's therapy goat still had some healing left to do after all. Elena unpacked her meager belongings, which took all of 5 minutes. 2 changes of clothes, some basic toiletries, Miguel's rosary that she couldn't bear to part with, and a photograph of the two of them taken the Christmas before he got sick. They were both grinning at the camera, Miguel's arm around her shoulders, completely unaware of the tragedy that awaited them. She placed the photo on the small table beside the bed, then immediately moved it to the dresser drawer. Looking at Miguel's face was still too painful, a reminder of everything she'd sacrificed and lost. The shower was everything she'd hoped for, and more. Hot water cascaded over her tired body, washing away 3 days of dust and despair. Elena stood under the spray until the water began to cool, reluctant to leave this small luxury. When she emerged, she felt almost human again. She put on her cleanest clothes and ventured outside to find Jake. He was in the barn, a large, well-organized building that smelled of hay and leather. Several horses lifted their heads to watch her enter, their ears pricked forward with curiosity rather than alarm. "Feeling better?" Jake asked, looking up from the stall he was mucking. "Much. Thank you." Elena looked around the barn, impressed by the orderly arrangement of tools and supplies. "This is a beautiful setup." "Took me 10 years to get it the way I wanted," Jake said, with obvious pride. "Every board and nail placed with purpose." "How long have you had the ranch?" 15 years. Bought it from an old-timer who was ready to retire. Place was pretty run down then, but it had good bones. Elena could see evidence of Jake's hard work everywhere she looked. This wasn't the ranch of someone who'd inherited wealth or success. This was the result of years of careful planning and backbreaking labor. "What did you do before ranching?" she asked. Jake's movement stilled for a moment. "Military. 20 years in the army." The tone of his voice suggested that was all he planned to say on the subject, and Elena didn't push. She understood the need to keep certain parts of the past locked away. "Want to meet the crew?" Jake asked, clearly changing the subject. He led her from stall to stall, introducing her to each horse by name and personality. There was Thunder, a massive draft horse with gentle eyes who immediately tried to search Elena's pockets for treats. Buttercup, a painted mare who was apparently the barn's resident troublemaker, and Star, an older gelding who'd been Jake's first horse and was now semi-retired. "They're beautiful," Elena said, meaning it. Each animal was clearly well cared for, with glossy coats and bright eyes that spoke of good health and proper attention. "Horses are easy," Jake said, scratching Thunder's massive neck. "They're honest. Treat them well, and they'll do anything for you. Treat them poorly, and they'll let you know exactly how they feel about it." Elena thought about the classroom full of third graders she'd left behind, how honest children could be in their trust and disappointment. The parallel made her chest ache. "And the goats?" she asked, eager to change the direction of her thoughts. Jake grinned. "Oh, the goats are a whole different story. Come on, I'll introduce you properly." The goat pen was larger than Elena had initially realized, with multiple sections connected by gates that allowed the animals to be separated as needed. Besides Trouble, there were 5 other goats of various sizes and breeds. "This is my main herd," Jake explained, opening the gate to let them in. The big guy there is Ranger. He's the herd king, so don't let his size intimidate you. He's actually a sweetheart. Ranger was indeed impressive, a massive boar cross who probably weighed close to 200 pounds. But as Jake had promised, he approached Elena with gentle curiosity, allowing her to scratch behind his ears. The brown one is Hazel, and she's pregnant with her first kid. Due any day now, so we'll need to keep an eye on her. Elena studied Hazel, noting the doe's swollen sides and the way she moved carefully. Has she kidded before? No, this is her first. The sire is a good buck I borrowed from a neighbor, so hopefully everything goes smoothly. I helped deliver kids when I was growing up, Elena offered. If you need an extra pair of hands when the time comes... Jake looked surprised and pleased. That would be great. It's always better to have someone experienced around for first-time mothers. They continued the introductions. Penny, a small Spanish goat who was apparently the herd's escape artist. Duke, a young buck who was all attitude and no sense. And finally Trouble, who hung back near the fence, eyeing Elena with wary interest. He's bonded with you, Elena observed, watching Trouble's behavior. Even if he won't admit it. Took months before he'd let me within arm's reach, Jake said. Now he follows me around the property, but he won't let me touch him unless he's sick or injured. Elena approached Trouble slowly, letting him get used to her scent. The young goat didn't run, but he didn't come closer either. Trauma like that changes you, Elena said softly, not sure if she was talking about Trouble or herself. Makes it hard to trust again, even when you want to. Jake glanced at her, and Elena had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing more than she intended to reveal. Sometimes all it takes is the right motivation, he said gently. As if summoned by their conversation, Pepper appeared at the fence line, having apparently figured out how to get closer to the goat pen. Trouble immediately perked up, moving to the fence with more animation than Elena had seen from him yet. Well, would you look at that? Jake murmured. Elena opened the gate and let Pepper into the pen. She expected some territorial posturing from the other goats, but instead found herself witnessing something remarkable. Ranger approached first, sniffing Pepper politely before apparently deciding she was acceptable. Hazel waddled over next, and soon Pepper was surrounded by curious but friendly goats. But it was Trouble's reaction that made Elena's breath catch. The traumatized kid moved directly to Pepper's side and stayed there, as if he'd found the missing piece of himself. I've never seen anything like it, Jake said quietly. It's like she's speaking his language. Elena watched Pepper gently bump noses with Trouble, the same way she'd comforted Miguel during his worst days. Some animals, Elena had learned, seemed to understand pain in a way that transcended species. She's special, Elena said. My brother used to say she could see into people's hearts. Smart brother? He was. Elena's voice caught slightly. He would have loved this place. Jake didn't ask what had happened to Miguel, for which Elena was grateful. Instead, he watched the goats interact with the satisfied expression of someone seeing a problem solve itself. Think she'll be happy here? He asked. Elena looked at Pepper, who was now lying in the shade, with Trouble pressed against her side while the other goats grazed nearby. I think she already is. And you? The question caught Elena off guard. She looked around the peaceful ranch, at the animals who'd accepted her without question, at the man who'd offered shelter to a stranger with no expectation of reward. Ask me again in a few days, she said carefully. Jake smiled. Fair enough. Come on, let's go look at that problem pasture while there's still light. The overgrown pasture was worse than Elena had initially thought. What had once been productive grazing land was now dominated by prickly pear cactus, mesquite, and various thorny shrubs that had created an almost impenetrable thicket. How long has it been like this? Elena asked, studying the extent of the overgrowth. 5 years, maybe 6. Previous owner let it go, and I've been too busy with other priorities to deal with it properly. Elena walked the fence line, assessing the challenge. It would be hard work, but not impossible. Goats were natural browsers, preferring shrubs and weeds to grass, and they could clear land that would be difficult or dangerous for humans to tackle. Pepper will love this, she said finally. She's always preferred thorny stuff to regular feed, and it'll give her something to do besides miss my brother. You really think she misses him? Elena nodded. Animals grieve just like people do. Sometimes I think they're more honest about it than we are. They walked back toward the barn as the sun began to set, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and purple. Elena found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in months, the peaceful rhythm of ranch life already working its magic on her frayed nerves. What time do you usually start in the morning? She asked. Dawn. Animals don't care if it's Saturday or Christmas. They still need to be fed. I'll be ready. Jake stopped walking and turned to look at her. Elena, you don't have to prove anything to me. You've had a hard day, and tomorrow we'll be here whether you're up at dawn or noon. But Elena shook her head. I meant what I said about earning my keep. Besides, I'm used to getting up early. Teachers are on the same schedule as farmers. You're a teacher? Elena's heart lurched as she realized what she'd revealed. Was, she said quickly. I was a teacher. Elementary school. Jake waited, clearly hoping she'd elaborate, but Elena couldn't bring herself to say more. How could she explain that she'd been a teacher who'd betrayed everything she'd stood for? That children had trusted her, and she'd stolen from them? Career change? Jake asked when it became clear she wasn't going to continue. Something like that. They reached the cabin as full darkness settled over the ranch. Jake pointed out the location of the main electrical panel and explained how the water system worked. Practical information delivered in a way that made Elena feel like a valued partner rather than a charity case. Breakfast is at 6 if you want to join me, he said as he prepared to leave. But, like I said, no pressure. I'll be there. Jake smiled and headed back toward the main house, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts for the first time since she'd stumbled onto his property. She sat on the cabin's small porch, listening to the night sounds of the desert. In the distance, she could hear the gentle sounds of the animals settling in for the night. It was peaceful in a way that Elena had almost forgotten existed. For 3 months, she'd been running on adrenaline and guilt, sleeping in her car and jumping at every siren. Now, for the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt something approaching safety. But with safety came the luxury of really thinking about what she'd done, and Elena found the guilt rising in her throat like bile. $57,000. Money that should have bought school supplies for children who needed them. Money she'd stolen to pay for treatments that hadn't even saved Miguel's life. She'd justified it at the time, telling herself that Miguel's life was worth more than school supplies, that she'd find a way to pay it back. But in her heart, she'd known it was wrong even as she'd done it. She'd been a teacher, someone children looked up to, and she'd betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. Elena pulled Miguel's rosary from her pocket, running the smooth beads through her fingers the way he'd taught her when they were children. Their grandmother had given it to him when he'd made his first communion, and he'd carried it through his entire illness, finding comfort in the familiar prayers even when the pain had been unbearable. I'm sorry, Miguel, she whispered to the desert night. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I ruined everything trying. The stars above offered no absolution, only distant light in an infinite darkness. Elena had never felt so alone, even surrounded by the peace of Jake's ranch. But somewhere in the darkness, she could hear Pepper's soft bleating, the sound carrying comfort across the distance between them. Elena smiled despite her tears. At least one of them was adjusting to their new life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. She'd have to be careful not to reveal too much about her past, had to find a way to work alongside Jake without letting him see the full extent of her shame. But tonight she had a roof over her head and a purpose for tomorrow. It was more than she'd had this morning, and for now, it would have to be enough. The rooster's crow pulled Elena from the deepest sleep she'd had in months. For a moment, she lay disoriented in the unfamiliar bed, sunlight streaming through yellow curtains she didn't recognize. Then memory flooded back, along with a mixture of relief and anxiety that had become her constant companion. She dressed quickly in her work clothes, the same faded jeans and cotton shirt she'd worn for farm work as a teenager. Outside, the desert air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and something sweet she couldn't identify. The main house showed warm light in the kitchen windows, and Elena could see Jake's silhouette moving around inside. She found him at the stove, stirring what smelled like the best coffee she'd encountered in weeks. He looked up when she entered, offering a smile that seemed genuinely pleased to see her. "Sleep okay?" he asked, reaching for another mug from the cabinet. "Better than I have in months," Elena admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. The first sip was strong and hot, exactly what she needed to chase away the last remnants of exhaustion. "Figured we'd start with the morning feeding," Jake said, leading her toward the door. "Get you acquainted with everyone's routine before we tackle the big project." The horses nickered softly as they approached the barn, clearly expecting their breakfast. Elena watched Jake measure out grain with practiced efficiency, noting how he adjusted portions based on each animal's needs. "Thunder gets extra because he's still growing," Jake explained, giving the young draft horse an affectionate pat. "Star gets less because he's older and doesn't move around as much. It's all about knowing your animals." Elena found herself thinking of her former students, how each child had needed different approaches to learning and encouragement. The parallel between teaching and animal care struck her as both comforting and painful. "You okay?" Jake asked, apparently noticing her distraction. "Fine," Elena said quickly. "Just thinking about something else." They moved on to the goat pen, where Pepper was already awake and clearly delighted to see Elena. But what made Elena's heart lift was the sight of Trouble pressed close to Pepper's side, the traumatized kid looking more relaxed than she'd seen him the day before. "Would you look at that?" Jake murmured, following her gaze. "Pepper's working miracles already." As they watched, Pepper gently nudged Trouble toward the hay feeder, encouraging him to eat. The other goats had learned to give Trouble space during feeding time, but with Pepper there, he seemed more confident about claiming his share. "She did the same thing with my brother," Elena said softly. "When he was too sick to want food, she'd somehow convince him to try just a little bit." Jake glanced at her, and Elena realized she'd revealed more than she'd intended. But his expression held only gentle curiosity, not the probing questions she'd learned to fear. "Sounds like she's a natural healer," he said simply. After the animals were fed, Jake showed Elena around the property boundaries, explaining the layout of pastures and water sources. The ranch was larger than she'd initially realized, with several hundred acres of diverse terrain from desert flats to rolling hills dotted with juniper and oak. "The back section is where most of the wildlife comes through," Jake explained as they walked. "Deer, javelinas, sometimes coyotes. The goats do fine with most of them, but coyotes can be a problem during kidding season." "How do you protect them?" "Guardian dogs, mostly. I've got 2 Great Pyrenees who live with the herd. They're out in the far pasture right now with the sheep, but you'll meet them eventually." Elena found herself genuinely interested in the ranch operations, asking questions about everything from water management to predator control. Jake answered patiently, clearly pleased by her engagement. "You're picking this up fast," he observed as they headed back toward the house. "Most city folks take weeks to understand how everything connects." "I'm not really city folk," Elena said. "My family had a small farm when I was growing up. Just a few acres, but we raised goats and chickens, grew our own vegetables." "What happened to it?" Elena's step faltered slightly. "My father sold it when my mother got sick. Medical bills." It was true as far as it went. Elena had learned that the best lies were built on foundations of truth, easier to remember, and less likely to contradict themselves. "That's rough," Jake said, and something in his voice suggested he understood financial desperation better than most. They spent the rest of the morning working together on routine maintenance tasks. Jake showed Elena how to check the automatic water systems, repair a section of fence that had been damaged by last week's winds, and organize the feed room for maximum efficiency. Elena threw herself into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised them both. After months of aimless wandering, having concrete tasks to accomplish felt like a gift. More than that, working alongside Jake felt comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. He was a good teacher, patient and thorough without being condescending. When Elena made mistakes, he corrected them matter-of-factly and moved on. When she picked up new skills quickly, he acknowledged her competence without making a big deal of it. "You sure you haven't done ranch work before?" he asked after watching her expertly splice a section of broken fence wire. "My father was a perfectionist," Elena said, testing the repair. "He always said if you're going to do something, do it right the first time." "Smart man," Elena smiled, remembering her father's calloused hands guiding hers as he taught her to use tools. He was a good teacher. Must run in the family. The casual comment made Elena freeze. Jake was examining the water trough, apparently unaware of what he'd said, but Elena felt like he'd just pulled the ground out from under her feet. "What makes you say that?" she asked carefully. Jake looked up, seeming genuinely confused by her reaction. "Just the way you explain things when you're helping. Very clear, very patient. Natural teaching instincts." Elena forced herself to relax. He was just making an observation, not probing into her past. But the reminder of her former career sent a familiar wave of guilt crashing over her. They broke for lunch around noon, sitting on Jake's front porch with sandwiches and cold drinks. The view from the porch stretched across the entire valley, an endless expanse of desert beauty that should have been peaceful but somehow made Elena feel exposed. "Been thinking about your goat situation," Jake said between bites. "Might make sense to start Pepper on the smaller section first, let her get used to the terrain before tackling the worst areas." Elena nodded, grateful for the practical focus. "She's tough, but smart about pacing herself. Better to start conservatively." "My thoughts exactly. Plus it'll give us a chance to see how she interacts with the guardian dogs when they rotate back this way." "When will that be?" "Next week, probably. They follow a pattern, spending a few days with each group of animals. Keeps the predators guessing." Elena found herself looking forward to meeting the dogs, to learning more about how all the pieces of the ranch operation fit together. It was easier to focus on the future when it involved practical concerns, rather than the emotional minefield of her past. "Jake," she said impulsively, "can I ask you something?" "Shoot. Why didn't you ask for references when you offered me this job? Most people would want to know more about someone before letting them live on their property." Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Because sometimes people need a fresh start without having to explain everything that came before. The simple answer hit Elena like a physical blow. She felt tears prick her eyes and had to look away. "Besides," Jake continued, apparently not noticing her reaction, "animals are better judges of character than people most of the time. The way Thunder and the goats took to you right away tells me more than any reference ever could." Elena managed a shaky smile. "Even Trouble seems to approve." "Especially Trouble. That kid's been my best early warning system since I found him. If he trusts someone, I trust them too." They finished lunch in comfortable silence, watching clouds build over the mountains in the distance. Elena felt a peace settling over her that she hadn't experienced since before Miguel's diagnosis. For the first time in months, she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder or planning her next escape route. The feeling lasted until Jake's phone rang. Elena watched his expression change as he answered, saw his body language shift from relaxed to alert. He walked away from the porch to continue the conversation, but she could catch fragments. "No, I told you. Thursday at the earliest. I don't care what the county says." When he returned, his face was tight with barely controlled frustration. "Everything okay?" Elena asked. "County inspector wants to do a surprise visit this afternoon. Something about updating our livestock permits." Elena felt her stomach drop. "Inspector?" "Routine stuff, mostly. But they like to throw their weight around sometimes, find violations where none exist." Jake rubbed his forehead tiredly. "Last time they were here, they tried to cite me for having too many animals in the main pasture. Took 3 weeks and a lawyer to prove they were wrong." "Will they want to see identification for everyone on the property?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Jake glanced at her sharply. "Why? You got some reason to avoid county officials?" Elena felt heat flood her cheeks. She'd revealed too much, let her fear show through her attempt at nonchalance. "No," she said quickly. I don't have a lot of paperwork with me right now. Driver's license is expired, that kind of thing." It was partially true. Her license would expire in another month, and she'd been dreading having to renew it because of the paper trail it would create. Jake studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. "Elena," he said gently, "I need you to level with me. Are you running from something that could bring trouble to my ranch?" The direct question caught Elena off guard. She wanted to lie, to give him some innocuous explanation that would satisfy his curiosity without revealing the truth. But looking into his honest brown eyes, she found she couldn't. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Most things worth running from are." Elena took a shaky breath. "I'm not dangerous, if that's what you're worried about. I've never hurt anyone, never been involved with anything violent or illegal in terms of—" She stopped, realizing she was painting herself into a corner. "In terms of what?" Jake asked quietly. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 months of deception pressing down on her. "I made some bad choices. When my brother was dying, I made some really bad choices. And now I'm dealing with the consequences." "What kind of choices?" Elena looked at Jake, this man who'd offered her sanctuary without asking questions, who'd shown her more kindness in 2 days than she'd received in months of running. He deserved better than lies and half-truths. "I took money," she said quietly. "Money that wasn't mine, to pay for my brother's treatment." Jake's expression didn't change, but Elena saw something shift in his eyes. Not judgment exactly, but a new wariness that made her heart sink. "How much money?" he asked. $57,000. Jake let out a low whistle. "That's not pocket change." "No, it's not." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the afternoon heat. "I told myself I'd pay it back, that it was just a loan. But Miguel died anyway, and now you're running from whoever you stole it from." Elena flinched at the word stole, even though it was accurate. "It was a charity fund. At the school where I taught, money that was supposed to help kids buy school supplies." She watched Jake's face carefully, waiting for the moment when his kindness would turn to disgust, when he'd realize what kind of person he'd invited onto his property. "Kids?" Jake asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Third graders. 8- and 9-year-olds who trusted me." Elena's voice broke on the last words. "I was their teacher, and I stole from them." Jake was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the horizon. Elena sat in miserable silence, already mentally packing her few belongings and trying to figure out where she and Pepper could go next. "How long do you figure before they catch up with you?" Jake asked finally. Elena looked up, surprised by the practical nature of the question. "I don't know. Could be days, could be months. I've been paying cash for everything, staying off the main highways. And when they do catch up? Prison, probably. Grand theft. Breach of fiduciary duty. My lawyer said I might get 5 to 10 years if I cooperate fully." Jake nodded slowly, processing this information. "The brother you mentioned, the one you stole the money for, what kind of treatment needed $57,000? "Experimental leukemia therapy. His insurance wouldn't cover it because it wasn't FDA approved yet." Elena felt tears starting to fall but didn't bother wiping them away. "I knew it was wrong. I knew I was betraying everything I believed in. But he was dying, Jake. He was 23 years old, and he was dying, and I couldn't just watch him slip away without trying everything." "Did it work?" "The treatment?" Elena shook her head. 3 weeks. He lasted 3 weeks after I'd spent everything. The cancer was too aggressive." Jake stood up and walked to the porch railing, his back to Elena. She watched the tension in his shoulders and prepared herself for the conversation that would end with her leaving. "Elena," he said without turning around, "I need you to understand something about my situation here. I understand. You can't afford to harbor a fugitive. I'll pack my things. Will you let me finish?" Jake turned back to face her, and Elena was surprised to see no anger in his expression. Concern, yes, and a deep sadness, but not the disgust she'd expected. "This ranch is everything to me," he continued. "It represents 15 years of work, every penny I could save, every dream I had for building something worthwhile after I got out of the army." Elena nodded miserably. "I know, and I've put it at risk just by being here." "But here's the thing," Jake said, sitting back down beside her. "I've got my own reasons for understanding what it's like when the system fails you." Elena looked up at him, confused. "My last tour in Afghanistan," Jake said quietly, "I had a soldier under my command. Kid named Danny Rodriguez, actually. Funny coincidence. Elena felt her breath catch at the familiar surname. Danny was 19, from some small town in Texas. Good kid, followed orders, looked out for his squad mates. But he was struggling with PTSD, having panic attacks during patrols. I filed reports, requested psychological evaluation, did everything by the book. Jake's hands clenched into fists on his knees. Command kept sending him back out. Said they were short-staffed, that Danny just needed to tough it out. So I went around them, tried to get him help through unofficial channels. What happened? Someone reported me for insubordination. While I was dealing with disciplinary hearings, Danny had a complete breakdown during a night patrol. Walked into an IED field because he thought he was back home in Texas. Elena felt sick. Oh, Jake. By the time I got the disciplinary action sorted out, Danny was dead and his family was asking why nobody had helped their son when he'd asked for it. Jake's voice was raw with old pain. I knew I'd done the right thing trying to help him, but the Army didn't see it that way. Damaged my career, cost me a promotion, made the last 2 years of my service hell. Elena stared at him, beginning to understand why he'd offered sanctuary to a stranger. I'm not saying what you did was right, Jake continued. Stealing is stealing, and those kids deserved better, but I understand what it's like to be caught between doing what's legal and doing what's right. So, you're not going to turn me in? Jake shook his head. I'm not going to turn you in. But Elena, you need to understand that this situation can't last forever. Eventually, you're going to have to face what you did. I know. Elena wiped her eyes, feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. I need time to figure out how to make things right. Fair enough, but if staying here puts you in more danger, if it makes things worse for you in the long run, then we need to talk about alternatives. Elena nodded, overwhelmed by his continued kindness even after learning the truth about her past. There's one more thing, Jake said. If the county inspector asks about you being here, what do you want me to say? Elena thought about it. The truth, mostly. I'm helping with land management, staying in the cabin temporarily. If he asks for identification, I'll show him what I have and hope he doesn't run any deep background checks. And if he does? Then I guess my time here is up. Jake reached over and squeezed her hand gently. Let's cross that bridge when we come to it. The county inspector arrived 2 hours later, a thin man in his 50s, with the demeanor of someone who enjoyed finding fault with other people's work. Elena watched from the cabin window as he got out of his official vehicle and adjusted his clipboard with officious importance. Jake met him at the gate, and Elena could see them talking as they walked toward the animal pens. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the inspector examine the facilities, occasionally making notes on his clipboard. When they approached the goat pen, Elena held her breath. Pepper was visible among the other animals, and Elena prayed that the inspector wouldn't ask too many questions about the newest addition to the herd. The inspection seemed to take forever. Elena watched as they moved from pen to pen, building to building, the inspector occasionally pointing at something and Jake responding with what appeared to be patient explanations. Finally, they walked toward the cabin. Elena quickly moved away from the window and tried to look like she'd been busy with normal activities rather than anxiously watching their every move. The knock on her door was firm, but not aggressive. Elena? Jake's voice called. Could you come out here for a minute? Elena took a deep breath and opened the door. The inspector was standing slightly behind Jake, his narrow face set in lines of professional skepticism. This is Elena Rodriguez, Jake said smoothly. She's helping me with land management and vegetation control. Ms. Rodriguez, the inspector said, consulting his clipboard. I'll need to see some identification for my records. Elena's hands shook slightly as she handed over her driver's license. The inspector examined it carefully, making notes on his form. Address shows Tucson, he observed. Long way from home. I'm between permanent addresses right now, Elena said, proud that her voice sounded steadier than she felt. And you're qualified for land management work? Elena felt Jake tense beside her, ready to jump in if needed. But she found her own voice. "I grew up on a farm. I've been working with livestock and land management my whole life." It was true enough, and delivered with enough confidence that the inspector seemed satisfied. He handed back her license and made a few more notes. "How long will you be staying on the property?" he asked. "That depends on how long the project takes," Elena replied. "Could be weeks, could be months." The inspector nodded and turned to Jake. "You'll need to file a temporary worker notification with the county office within 30 days if she's staying longer than that." "Already planning on it," Jake said. "Is there anything else you need?" The inspector consulted his clipboard one more time. "Looks like everything's in order. I'll have my report filed by Friday." Elena watched him walk back to his vehicle, not allowing herself to relax until his car disappeared down the driveway. "Well," Jake said, "that went better than expected." Elena sank down on the cabin's front step, suddenly exhausted. "I thought for sure he was going to arrest me on the spot. He's just a county inspector, not law enforcement. Besides, he was more interested in finding code violations than running background checks." "This time," Elena said. "But Jake, what if he does file that worker notification? What if it creates a paper trail that leads them to me?" Jake sat down beside her. "Then we'll deal with it when it happens. But Elena, hiding out here indefinitely isn't really a solution. You're going to have to face this eventually." "I know, I'm not ready yet." "What would make you ready?" Elena thought about it. "I need to figure out how to pay the money back. If I could make restitution, maybe the sentence wouldn't be as harsh. $57,000 is a lot of money. I know, but maybe if I worked steadily, saved every penny." Jake was quiet for a moment. "Elena, at ranch wages, it would take you years to save that kind of money. And that's assuming you could find work without references, without a background check." The reality of her situation hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on staying hidden that she hadn't really thought through the long-term impossibility of her circumstances. "So what are you saying?" she asked. "That I should just turn myself in now?" "I'm saying maybe it's time to stop running and start planning. Talk to a lawyer, figure out your real options instead of just reacting to fear." Elena looked out across the peaceful ranch, at Pepper grazing contentedly with her new friends, at the landscape that had begun to feel like home. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know. But, Elena, the life you're living now isn't really living. You're just existing, waiting for the other shoe to drop." He was right, and Elena knew it. The constant fear, the inability to make real connections or plan for the future, the way she jumped at every unexpected sound or unfamiliar car. It wasn't sustainable. "Will you help me?" she asked quietly. "When I'm ready to deal with this properly." Jake smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since her confession. "Of course. Whatever you need." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple. In the distance, Elena could hear the gentle sounds of the animals settling in for the night, including Pepper's distinctive bleat as she called to trouble. "Jake?" Elena said finally. "Yeah? Thank you. For everything. For giving me a place to think, to figure things out without pressure." "We all need sanctuary sometimes," Jake replied. "The trick is knowing when it's time to leave it behind and face the world again." Elena nodded, understanding that he was giving her permission to stay as long as she needed, while also acknowledging that this couldn't be permanent. "Tomorrow," she said, "let's start Pepper on that problem pasture. I want to earn my keep while I'm figuring out the rest." "Sounds like a plan." As they stood to go inside, Elena caught sight of movement in the goat pen. Pepper and Trouble were lying side by side under the shelter. The traumatized kid finally relaxed enough to sleep peacefully. "Look at that," Jake said softly, following her gaze. "Healing," Elena murmured. "They're healing each other. Maybe that's what we all need," Jake said. "Someone who understands our particular kind of broken." Elena looked at him. This man who'd offered shelter to a stranger and continued offering it even after learning the truth about her past. Maybe he was right. Maybe healing was possible, even for someone who'd lost her way as completely as she had. But first, she had to find the courage to stop running and start facing the consequences of her choices. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she'd start working toward redemption, instead of just hiding from guilt. Tonight, though, she'd allow herself to rest in the safety Jake had provided. To sleep peacefully for one more night before beginning the hard work of rebuilding her life. The desert stars stretched endlessly overhead as Elena made her way back to the cabin, brighter than any stars she'd seen in the city, offering their ancient light to guide lost travelers home. 2 weeks had passed since Elena's confession, and she'd fallen into a rhythm at Holloway Ranch that felt dangerously close to contentment. Each morning she woke before dawn to help Jake with feeding, then spent her days working alongside Pepper to clear the overgrown pasture. The little goat had taken to the work with enthusiasm, methodically stripping thorny shrubs and clearing pathways through the dense undergrowth. Elena found peace in the physical labor, the simple satisfaction of watching clear ground emerge from chaotic vegetation. But beneath the surface calm, she knew time was running out. The county inspector's visit had been a warning, a reminder that she couldn't hide forever. She was thinking about this as she worked to untangle Pepper from a particularly stubborn mesquite bush when she heard the unfamiliar sound of a car engine coming up the drive. Elena's blood froze. Jake wasn't expecting anyone, and unannounced visitors had become her greatest fear. She crept to the edge of the pasture where she could see the driveway without being visible herself. A dusty sedan was pulling up to the main house, and Elena's heart nearly stopped when she saw who got out. Detective Morrison, the same weathered face, the same tired eyes she remembered from their interview in Tucson 3 months ago. He was here, which meant her time had run out. Elena's first instinct was to run. She could grab Pepper, slip through the back fence, and disappear into the desert before anyone knew she was gone. But as she watched Jake emerge from the barn to greet the detective, she realized she couldn't do it. Jake had offered her sanctuary, had continued to trust her even after learning the truth. She couldn't repay that kindness by bringing trouble to his doorstep and then vanishing like a coward. Instead, she walked slowly toward the house, Pepper trotting beside her with blissful ignorance of what was coming. Detective Morrison spotted her approach, and Elena saw recognition flicker across his features. "Elena Rodriguez," he called out. "We need to talk." Jake looked between them, understanding immediately what was happening. "Detective, I assume?" "Jake Holloway." "This is my property." "Jim Morrison, Tucson Police Department. I'm here about Ms. Rodriguez. We've been looking for her for quite some time." Elena felt her legs go weak, but she forced herself to keep walking until she was standing beside Jake. "Hello, Detective Morrison." "Elena, you've led us quite a chase." Morrison's voice was tired, rather than angry. 3 months. 4 states, and we finally tracked you down through a traffic camera in Flagstaff. Elena's mind raced. A traffic camera. She'd been so careful with cash transactions and back roads, but she'd forgotten about the surveillance network that monitored every highway. "Are you here to arrest me?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Morrison glanced at Jake, then back at Elena. "That depends. Are you planning to come quietly, or am I going to have more paperwork to fill out?" "She's not going anywhere without a lawyer," Jake said firmly. Elena looked at him in surprise. "Jake, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Jake's voice was calm but determined. "Detective, Ms. Rodriguez has been working on my ranch as an employee. If you're planning to arrest her, I want to make sure her rights are protected." Morrison studied Jake with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read people quickly. "You know what she's accused of?" "I do." "And you still want to vouch for her?" "I do." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at Jake's unwavering support, even in the face of law enforcement. Morrison sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Look, Rodriguez, I'm not here to drag you away in handcuffs. The DA's office has been reviewing your case, and there are some things we need to discuss." Elena blinked in confusion. "I don't understand." "The stolen money." Turns out the situation is more complicated than we initially thought. Jake gestured toward his front porch. Why don't we sit down and talk this through properly? They settled onto Jake's porch chairs, and Elena found herself gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles were white. Pepper, sensing her distress, came to stand beside her chair, offering silent comfort. Morrison pulled out a worn notebook and flipped through several pages. Elena, after you disappeared, we kept investigating. Turns out you weren't the only one with access to that charity account. Elena's heart hammered. What do you mean? Principal Watson came forward with some additional information. Seems she'd been noticing discrepancies in the fund for months before your withdrawal. Small amounts, but consistent. I don't understand, Elena said. The school's bookkeeper, Linda Cervantes, had been skimming from the charity fund for over a year. Small amounts, few hundred here and there, but it added up. When the audit revealed the big withdrawal you made, it also uncovered her pattern of theft. Elena felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Linda was stealing too? $53,000 over 18 months. Turns out she had a gambling problem, needed money to pay off debts to some very unfriendly creditors. Jake leaned forward. So Elena wasn't the only one who stole from the fund? Not by a long shot. And here's the thing. Elena Cervantes had set up the withdrawals to make it look like different people were accessing the account. When you made your withdrawal, it triggered the audit that exposed everything. Elena stared at Morrison, trying to process this information. Are you saying I accidentally helped catch her? In a way, yes. If you hadn't taken that money when you did, Cervantes might have drained the entire fund and covered her tracks. Your withdrawal was so large it forced the early audit. Elena felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that she wasn't the only criminal, guilt that she'd still stolen money regardless of Linda's actions, and confusion about what this meant for her situation. Detective, Jake said carefully, what exactly are you telling us? Morrison closed his notebook and looked directly at Elena. I'm telling you that the DA is willing to consider a plea agreement. Community service, restitution, probation, instead of prison time. Especially considering that your theft led to uncovering a much larger pattern of embezzlement. Elena's breath caught. No prison. Not if you cooperate fully and agree to the terms. The DA wants to focus on Cervantes. She's the bigger fish, and she's been stealing for much longer. Elena felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. What about the restitution? I don't have $57,000. That's part of what we need to discuss. The DA is willing to work out a payment plan based on your ability to pay. And here's something else. The insurance company is covering most of the fund's losses because of Cervantes' pattern of theft. Your portion might be negotiable. Jake reached over and squeezed Elena's hand. This is good news, Elena. I still stole money, Elena said through her tears. I still betrayed those children's trust. Morrison's expression softened. Elena, I've been doing this for 25 years. I've seen people steal for greed, for drugs, for revenge. What you did was wrong, but you did it trying to save your brother's life. The DA understands the difference. Elena looked out across the ranch, at Pepper grazing peacefully with the other goats, at the cleared pasture that represented weeks of honest work. What happens now? Now you come back to Tucson with me voluntarily, and we work out the details with your lawyer in the DA's office. Could take a few days, maybe a week. And then? Morrison shrugged. Assuming you accept the plea agreement, you serve your community service, start making restitution payments, and get on with your life. Elena turned to Jake, her heart breaking at the thought of leaving the peace she'd found here. I have to go. I know, Jake said gently, but, Elena, this doesn't have to be goodbye forever. What do you mean? Jake smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since Morrison's arrival. I mean, I still have a weed problem. And Pepper's only cleared about a quarter of that pasture. Elena stared at him. You'd want me to come back, even after all this? Elena, you've worked harder in 2 weeks than some people work in 2 months. You've helped heal one of my most traumatized animals. You've been honest with me when honesty was difficult. Jake's voice was warm with sincerity. Why wouldn't I want you to come back? Morrison cleared his throat. Actually, steady employment would be a strong point in your favor for the plea agreement. Shows stability, commitment to making amends. Elena felt a flutter of hope in her chest, fragile but real. You really mean it? I could come back here? Only if you want to, Jake said. But Elena, I need you to understand something. If you come back, it's not as someone hiding from her past. It's as someone who's faced her mistakes and is working to make things right. Elena nodded, finally understanding what Jake had been trying to tell her for weeks. Running had never been the solution. Hiding had only prolonged her suffering and prevented her from finding a real path forward. Okay, she said, standing up with more confidence than she'd felt in months. Detective Morrison, I'm ready to go with you. But I need to ask one favor. What's that? Elena looked at Pepper, who was watching the conversation with alert interest. Can Pepper stay here while I deal with this? I don't want to disrupt her life again, and she's happy here. Jake stood up as well. She's welcome to stay as long as she needs. Trouble would probably pine away if she left now anyway. As if summoned by his name, Trouble appeared around the corner of the house, immediately seeking out Pepper for their usual afternoon nuzzling session. Look at that, Morrison said, watching the two goats greet each other. Seems like everyone's found where they belong. Elena packed her few belongings quickly, her heart heavy despite the hopeful turn of events. Jake walked her to Morrison's car, Pepper following closely behind, as if sensing something important was happening. How long do you think it'll take? Jake asked Morrison. Hard to say. Could be a week, could be a month. Depends on how quickly we can work through the legal details. Elena knelt down to hug Pepper goodbye, burying her face in the goat's soft fur. Be good, girl. Take care of Trouble for me. Pepper bleated softly and nuzzled Elena's neck, a gesture of comfort that made Elena's eyes fill with tears again. She'll be fine, Jake assured her. And so will you. Elena stood up and faced Jake, this man who'd offered sanctuary to a stranger and continued to offer hope even when that stranger turned out to be a criminal. Jake, I don't know how to thank you. For everything. For seeing something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. You saved yourself, Elena. I just provided a safe place for you to figure that out. On impulse, Elena reached up and hugged him, feeling his arms come around her in a gesture of friendship and support that meant more than any words could express. I'll be back, she whispered. I'll be here, he replied. The drive to Tucson was quiet, Elena lost in thought as the familiar desert landscape rolled past the car windows. Morrison seemed to understand her need for silence, only speaking when he needed to explain what would happen when they reached the police station. One more thing, he said as they neared the city limits. Your principal, Mrs. Watson, asked me to give you a message. Elena tensed. What did she say? She said to tell you that room 14 misses its teacher, and that second chances are what education is all about. Elena closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the unexpected forgiveness from the woman she'd most feared facing. The legal proceedings took exactly 10 days. Elena met with lawyers, signed papers, and stood before a judge who sentenced her to 2 years of community service, to be served at educational nonprofits, and restitution payments of $800 per month for 5 years. The amount was manageable, especially with the prospect of steady employment at the ranch. The media attention was minimal. Elena Rodriguez's story was overshadowed by Linda Cervantes' more dramatic embezzlement scheme and subsequent arrest. For once, Elena was grateful to be overshadowed by someone else's scandal. On a Thursday morning in late October, Detective Morrison drove Elena back to the ranch. The desert had changed in her absence, autumn bringing subtle shifts in color and light that made the landscape seem even more beautiful than she remembered. Jake was waiting on his front porch when they pulled up, and Elena's heart lifted at the sight of him. But what made her laugh out loud was the scene in the goat pen. Pepper and Trouble were standing side by side at the fence, both of them watching the driveway as if they'd been waiting for her return. Looks like you were expected, Morrison observed with a smile. Elena thanked the detective and watched him drive away before turning to face Jake. For a moment they just looked at each other, and Elena felt the weight of everything that had changed between her departure and return. How did it go? Jake asked. Better than I deserved, Elena replied honestly. Community service, restitution payments, but no prison. And Jake, they want me to do my service hours at educational nonprofits. I might actually be able to teach again someday. Jake's smile was brilliant. That's wonderful, Elena. Really wonderful. They walked together toward the goat pen, where Pepper was now making increasingly urgent bleating sounds, clearly demanding Elena's immediate attention. How has she been? Elena asked. Productive. She and Trouble cleared another quarter of the pasture while you were gone. But she's been watching the driveway every day, especially in the mornings when your car would normally come back from town. Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion. She opened the pen gate and was immediately surrounded by goats, all of them seeming to welcome her back. But Pepper's greeting was special, the little goat pressing close to Elena's side and staying there, as if determined never to let her leave again. I missed you too, girl, Elena whispered, scratching behind Pepper's ears. So, Jake said casually, ready to get back to work? Those weeds aren't going to clear themselves. Elena looked at him, this man who'd given her sanctuary when she needed it most, and welcomed her back without question after she'd faced her past. Actually, she said, I was thinking we might need to expand the project. I saw some overgrown areas on the north side that could use attention. Jake raised an eyebrow. Planning to stay a while, are you? Elena smiled, feeling truly happy for the first time since Miguel's death. If you'll have me. I figure I owe you about 5 years of weed clearing to make up for all the trouble I've caused. 5 years, huh? That's a pretty long-term commitment. The best kind, Elena replied, looking around at the ranch that had become her refuge and was now becoming her home. Jake, can I ask you something? Anything. That first day, when you said Pepper could stay if she ate weeds, did you know what you were really offering? Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze following the goats as they grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. I knew you both needed a place to heal. Sometimes that's all you can offer someone. Time and space to figure out who they want to be next. Elena nodded, understanding that Jake had given her something more precious than shelter. He'd given her the chance to discover that she was more than her worst mistake, that redemption was possible for someone willing to do the hard work of earning it. Well, she said, picking up a pair of work gloves from the fence post, I guess we'd better get started. These weeds won't clear themselves. As they walked toward the overgrown pasture together, Pepper and Trouble trotting alongside them, Elena felt the last of her fear and guilt begin to transform into something else. Purpose, hope, and the quiet satisfaction of honest work. She'd found her way home at last, not to a place, but to a life worth living. Surrounded by people and animals who'd chosen to love her not despite her flaws, but because of her willingness to face them and grow beyond them. The Arizona sun beat down on the desert landscape, casting long shadows that stretched toward tomorrow's possibilities. And in the heart of it all, a woman who'd lost her way was finally, truly found. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.